It was a Thursday morning when my mother called me. I was standing in the break room of a logistics office in Austin, Texas, the kind of fluorescent-lit room that smells like burnt coffee and nobody's ambition. I had a paper cup in my hand that I never ended up drinking from. I remember that detail specifically, the way the steam curled up from it and disappeared while I listened to her voice on the other end of the line. "I'm fine," she said. "Don't worry about me." Those 5 words, I've turned them over in my mind 10,000 times since that morning. I have examined every syllable the way a detective examines a crime scene, looking for the thing I missed, the crack in the wall I should have noticed, because the truth is, something in me did notice. There was a half second, less than that, a quarter of a second where the back of my brain said, "That's not her voice, not her real voice. Not the voice she used when she meant what she said." But I was tired. I was behind on a project. I had 3 unread emails from my manager, and the kind of low-grade anxiety that had become so constant, I'd stopped recognizing it as anxiety at all. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself she was fine. She said so herself. I said, "Okay, Mom, I love you." She said, "I love you too, baby." And I hung up the phone, threw the paper cup of coffee in the trash, and walked back to my desk. If I had known what "I'm fine" really meant that morning, if I had known what was happening inside the walls of the home she raised me in, what was being done to her while I sat 3 states away convincing myself everything was okay, I would not have walked back to that desk. I would have driven to the airport. I would have taken the first flight home, and I would not have stopped until I was standing in front of her door. But I didn't know, and by the time I found out, so much had already been taken from her that no verdict, no justice, no amount of anything could ever fully give it back. This is the story I never wanted to have to tell. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 31 years old when this happened. I want to tell you that I was some kind of exceptional person, that I had my life together, that I had reasons to feel good about myself. But the truth is more complicated than that. And if I'm going to tell you this story, I'm going to tell it honestly. I grew up in a small city in central Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your business and nobody's particularly surprised when things go wrong. My mother raised me mostly on her own after my father left when I was 9. We didn't have a lot, but she made sure I had enough food, enough warmth, enough of her time that I never felt the absence of the other parent as acutely as maybe I should have. She was everything. She was the whole structure of my childhood. I moved to Columbus for college, studied business administration, graduated with a degree and about $40,000 in student loan debt that, by the time I was 31, had grown with interest and poor financial decisions and 2 years of underemployment in my mid-20s to something closer to $62,000. I'm not proud of that number. I'm just telling you it's real. I was working as a supply chain coordinator for a mid-sized distribution company. The salary was decent, $56,000 a year, but after rent, loan payments, car insurance, utilities, and the monthly minimum on 2 credit cards that I'd used to cover medical bills in 2019, I was living with about $200 of breathing room per month, some months less. The kind of financial tightness where one unexpected expense, a car repair, a dental bill, a parking ticket, can take you from struggling to drowning overnight. I had been in that position for 3 years, not getting worse, not getting better, just hovering, and I had started to feel it in ways that went beyond money, in the way I slept, in the way I talked to people, in the quiet but persistent feeling that something in my life had stalled and I didn't know how to unstall it. Then the Austin opportunity came. A former colleague had connected me with a regional logistics firm that was expanding its operations into the Southwest. They needed someone with my specific combination of experience and were willing to pay $68,000 to start, with a performance review at 6 months. $12,000 more per year. Health benefits that were actually good. A relocation package that would cover my move and 2 months of temporary housing while I found a place. It wasn't a dream job. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't some life-changing passion project. It was a better number on a piece of paper and the possibility, just the possibility, of getting above water. Of not checking my bank balance before I bought groceries. That was enough. That felt like everything. But there was my mother, Her name was Patricia Mercer. Everyone called her Patty, and she was 67 years old, living in the same house in Ohio she'd lived in for 22 years. She had some health issues, nothing critical at the time, but she was not someone I felt entirely comfortable leaving. She was my person. She had always been my person. The conversation where I told her about Austin was one of the hardest I've ever had. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped me with homework, where we'd eaten every Thanksgiving, where she'd told me about my father's departure in terms designed to protect me from the worst of it, and I laid out the opportunity, the numbers, what it could mean. She listened to everything. She asked a few practical questions. And then she looked at me across that table and said, without any drama, without any guilt, "Daniel, don't let me hold you back. You go. You build your life." I didn't want to cry in front of her, so I didn't. I waited until I got to my car. I set a timeline. I would go for 6 months. I would evaluate at 6 months whether to stay or return. I would call her every week, send money when I could, and visit for the holidays no matter what. That was the plan. That was what I told myself. The last image I have of leaving is this. I was backing my car out of her driveway early on a Saturday morning, October. The trees half orange and half bare, and she was standing on the front porch in her blue bathrobe with her coffee cup, waving at me with her whole arm the way she had waved at me my entire life. Like she wanted to make sure I could see her, like she wanted me to carry that image with me. I drove away looking at her in my rearview mirror until she disappeared. I did not know that was the last time I would see her standing up straight and unafraid. Her name was Renee Caldwell, though by the time this happened, she had been Renee Mercer for 4 years, having married my younger half-brother Marcus, in what I genuinely considered one of the happiest weekends of my adult life. I need to tell you about Renee, because if I don't tell you who she appeared to be, you won't understand the magnitude of what she did. I had known Renee for 6 years before any of this. Marcus met her at a church event in 2017, brought her to a family cookout 3 months later, and she was one of those people who fits immediately. Warm, funny, quick with a compliment that never felt fake. The kind of person who remembers your coffee order after meeting you once and actually brings it next time. She was a nurse, a pediatric nurse, which should tell you something about the particular cruelty of what came later. She and my mother adored each other. That is not an exaggeration or a revisionist memory. They genuinely, completely adored each other. My mother used to call Renee the daughter I never had. She would say it to Renee's face, and Renee would squeeze her hand and say, "Right back at you, Mom." And it felt true. It felt like a real thing that existed between them. When I got the Austin offer and started thinking seriously about what my mother's daily life would look like without me nearby, Renee was the first person I thought of. She and Marcus lived 20 minutes from my mother's house. Renee worked 3 days a week, 12-hour shifts, and had 2 days and full weekends mostly free. She was medically trained. She loved my mother. The situation seemed almost designed. Marcus was going to be traveling for work. He was in regional sales, gone Monday through Thursday most weeks, so Renee would be home a lot. She knew my mother's medications. She knew her routines. She had driven my mother to doctor's appointments before, out of pure generosity, before I had even asked. I asked her directly the week before I left. We were standing in my mother's living room and I said, "Renee, I need to ask you something serious," and she turned to face me with complete attention, no phone in hand, eyes steady, and said, "Anything, Daniel. You know that." I explained what I needed. Regular check-ins, a few visits a week, help with groceries when necessary, keeping me informed if anything changed. She listened to every word, and when I finished, she walked over to my mother and took both of her hands in hers and said, "Miss Patty, I've got you. You are not going to be alone." My mother smiled, that soft, grateful smile she had when something moved her, but she didn't want to make a fuss and said, "I know, sweetheart." I took a photograph that afternoon. The two of them on the front porch, Renee with her arm around my mother's shoulders, both of them smiling at the camera in the October sun. My mother's hair was freshly done. She looked good. She looked safe. I still have that photograph. I have looked at it many times since and tried to read Renee's face, tried to find in her expression some shadow of what was coming. I have never been able to find it. Whatever she was a perfect actress. I left for Austin believing with my whole chest that my mother was in the best possible hands. Patricia Ann Mercer, Patty, Mum. She was 67 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, with silver hair she wore cut just below her ears and hands that were always slightly rougher than you expected when she touched your face. She had brown eyes with gold in them that you only noticed if you were close enough, which most people weren't. I was. She walked with a slight forward lean, like she was always gently headed somewhere with purpose. She made a small sound, not quite a hum, not quite a word when she was thinking hard about something. She called everyone baby as a term of endearment, indiscriminately the mail carrier and the cashier at the grocery store and me, all baby, all said with the same warmth. She made the best pie in any room she had ever been in and was uninterested in debating this point. She kept 3 prayer cards in her wallet at all times and had kept the same 3 since I was a child. There are 4 memories I carry with me that I want to tell you about. Not because they are the biggest or the most dramatic things that ever happened between us, but because they are the ones that tell you who she was. Ask. The first. I was 11 years old and had broken my only pair of sneakers. The sole had separated from the toe and was flapping embarrassingly when I walked 2 weeks before school started. We had no money that month. I knew we had no money. My mother knew I knew. She told me we figure it out, which I understood to mean we wouldn't. 3 days later, she came home from work and put a shoebox on my bed. New sneakers my size, the exact pair I'd pointed out in a store window 6 weeks earlier, and then immediately walked away from because I knew better than to want things we couldn't afford. She had worked an extra shift. She hadn't told me she was doing it. She just did it, and then acted like it was nothing. That was the whole story of her love. She acted like it was nothing. It was never nothing. Ask. The second. And I was 24 and had just lost a job under embarrassing circumstances, a mistake I'd made, not a layoff, genuinely my fault, and I drove to her house at 10 at night without calling first, not entirely sure why I went there and not somewhere else. She opened the door before I knocked. I don't know how she knew I was there. She just opened the door, looked at my face and said, "Come in, baby. I'll make tea." She did not ask what happened. She did not say anything about responsibility or consequences. She sat across from me for 2 hours and let me talk when I needed to, and be quiet when I needed to, and somewhere in that kitchen she made me feel like a person who was going to be okay. I have tried to describe what that felt like to people who didn't know her, and I have never been able to do it accurately. It was the absence of judgment. The complete, unconditional absence of it. Ask. The third. Ask. Every Sunday morning for as long as I can remember, we made pancakes together, not a big production, just pancakes, her recipe, which she had memorized so thoroughly she didn't even own the index card it was once written on. She would pour the batter and I would flip, even when I was bad at it, even when I was a teenager who pretended not to care about this ritual anymore. We would talk while we cooked about everything and nothing, about the week and the news, and old memories and things neither of us had a category for. Those Sunday mornings are the specific, physical texture of what home means to me. The smell of butter and batter and her coffee and the Ohio morning light coming through the window over the sink. Ask. The fourth. I was leaving for college. I was packing boxes in my room, and she appeared in the doorway and stood there until I noticed her, and when I looked up she said, completely out of nowhere, "Daniel, I need you to know something. Whatever happens out there, whatever you do or don't do, whatever you become or don't become, you are the greatest thing in my life. You have always been enough. Don't you ever let anybody make you feel otherwise." Then she walked back to the kitchen. She never brought it up again. She said what she needed to say, and then she let me go. That is one of the greatest gifts anyone has ever given me, and I did not fully understand it until I was much older. She dreamed of seeing me settled, not rich, not famous, just settled and at peace. She wanted grandchildren with a hope she was gracious enough not to weaponize. She wanted to grow her garden until her hands didn't work anymore. She wanted Sunday mornings to keep going forever. She deserved all of that. Call number 1, month 2. It was a Tuesday evening in November. I was in my temporary housing in Austin, a one-bedroom corporate apartment with beige walls and furniture that belonged to no one, and I was in a decent mood. The job was going better than expected. I had made one friend, a co-worker named James, who was funny and direct and made the office bearable. I was starting to feel like the decision had been the right one. My mother called at 7:14 p.m. I answered on the second ring. We talked about small things first, the weather in Ohio, a neighbor's new dog, a recipe she had tried. She sounded like herself. Warm, unhurried, interested. And then, in the background, I heard something. It was brief, a raised voice, low, tight, clipped, followed by a sound like something being set down too hard on a counter. A controlled slam. And then silence. "What was that?" I asked. "Oh, it's just the TV," my mother said. Immediately. Too immediately. No pause. I sat with that for a moment, tried to locate the thing that felt wrong about it. The voice in the background hadn't sounded like television. It had the quality of something live, something with temperature in it. But my mother's voice had returned to normal, smooth, easy, unbothered, and I didn't know how to press without sounding accusatory. We talked for another 10 minutes and said goodnight. For the next 5 days, I could not stop thinking about that sound. I replayed it. I described it to James over lunch vaguely, without details, and he said, "Man, you're probably overthinking it." And I wanted him to be right. I needed him to be right, because the alternative, that something was wrong inside my mother's house while I sat in Texas, was not something I was equipped to act on in any clear way. I talked myself down. I moved on. That was the first sign, and I chose not to see it. Call later 2. Month 4, by January, I had my own apartment. I had cooked my first meal in it. Nothing impressive, pasta and jarred sauce, and had stood at my kitchen window looking at an unfamiliar skyline, thinking about Ohio, thinking about Sunday mornings, feeling for the first time something that might have been homesickness. When my mother called that Friday, I answered with a kind of relief. I had been missing her voice, but the voice I got was not quite the one I'd been missing. She sounded tired in a way that was new, not sleepy tired. Tired in a deeper register, the kind of tired that lives in a person's chest and shows in the pauses between their words. Her sentences were shorter. Her laugh, when it came with a delay, like it had to travel further than it used to. She said she was fine. She said things were good. But the word good landed flat, emptied of whatever it's supposed to hold. And then, while she was speaking, I heard it again. A voice, Renee's voice from somewhere, close in the house, tight and low. Not the words, just the tone, the kind of tone that is technically quiet and is somehow louder than a shout. My mother stopped mid-sentence. There was a pause. When she came back, she sounded smaller. "I should let you go," she said. "You're busy." "Mom, I'm not busy. Are you okay?" "I'm okay, baby. I love you." I opened my laptop that night and pulled up flights to Ohio. I had a tab open, round trip, Austin to Columbus, Friday to Monday, $240, and I sat looking at it for a long time. And then my phone buzzed, a text from Renee. "Hey Daniel, just checking in. Your mom is doing really well. She had a great day today. We made soup together. She's in good spirits. Don't worry." I closed the flight tab. A week later, I called my mother again, and she sounded better. Lighter. I chose to believe it. That was my second chance. I didn't take it. Cow 3, month 6. I don't know how to explain what I felt before I answered this call. It was a Thursday afternoon, the same time of week as the first call, and when her number appeared on my screen, my hand went cold, not figuratively. The physical temperature of my hand dropped. Something in me knew before I answered. She barely spoke. "Ugh," she said hello and confirmed it was me, and then she said almost nothing. Monosyllables. Yes. Fine. Okay. Like each word cost something she didn't have much left of. There was a long silence, and I said, "Mom, talk to me. Please, something's wrong." And she started to say something I still don't know what she was going to say, and then I heard Renee's voice, close and sharp, and the sound cut off. And then my mother said, in a voice that did not sound like her voice at all, "I have to go now." "Mom, goodbye, Daniel." The call ended. I called back 7 times. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. I texted Renee. No response for 3 hours. When she finally responded, it was a single line. She's resting. She's fine. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my Austin apartment and stared at the ceiling and listened to my own heartbeat, and something in me, not logic, not evidence, something older and more animal than either of those things said, "Go home. Go home right now." That was my last warning, the last one I would ever get. I learned the truth in fragments, from my mother, from neighbors, from medical records. But I want to lay it out here all at once, because the truth deserves to be stated clearly and completely and without softening. Starting within the first 3 weeks of my departure, Renee had begun reducing my mother's meals, not eliminating them, nothing so obvious, but cutting portions, spacing meals further apart, forgetting to shop until the refrigerator held almost nothing worth eating. My mother, who had spent 67 years feeding other people and who found it almost impossible to ask for things for herself, said nothing for weeks. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she was probably eating too much anyway. She had been conditioned, slowly and expertly, to question her own needs. By month 2, my mother had lost 11 pounds. She was tired all the time in a way she hadn't been tired before, though she attributed this to age. Her blood pressure medication ran out during the 3rd month, and Renee, who picked up prescriptions, simply didn't refill it. My mother asked twice. She was told it was being handled. It was not handled. The emotional abuse was quieter and therefore harder to document, but no less real. Renee spoke to my mother in a register of barely contained contempt, never screaming, never obviously cruel, but a constant low-frequency hostility that communicated in 100 small daily ways that my mother was a burden, an inconvenience, something to be managed. She criticized how my mother folded laundry. She commented on how long my mother took in the bathroom. She sighed elaborately when my mother asked for help with something, the sigh designed to make the asking feel shameful. She cut off my mother's contact with the outside world gradually enough that my mother didn't notice it happening. The neighbor who used to stop by twice a week was told my mother wasn't feeling well, wasn't up for visitors. A friend from church who called regularly was told my mother would call back. My mother never knew the calls had come. My mother's world shrank until it contained almost nothing except the 4 walls of that house and Renee's daily performance of reluctant caretaking. The house itself told part of the story. The kitchen, which my mother had kept spotless for 22 years, had dishes in the sink and a floor that hadn't been swept. The bathroom had mold in the corner of the shower. My mother's bedroom, a sanctuary, the room she had always kept neat as a form of personal dignity, had laundry on the floor and a window that hadn't been opened in weeks. And then there was the worst thing. One evening in month 4, my mother told me this with great difficulty, stopping several times, her hands in her lap. Renee stood in the doorway of my mother's bedroom after my mother had asked again about the medication. And Renee looked at her and said, in a voice so flat and calm, it was almost worse than if she had screamed it, "Daniel left because he was tired of dealing with you. He's not coming back. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be." My mother said she didn't respond. She said she turned her face toward the window and waited for Renee to leave the room. And when Renee left, she cried quietly, the way she had learned to cry in that house, in a way that didn't make noise and didn't invite attention. She cried because part of her, in her weakened and isolated state, had started to believe it. Ask. I will never forget that as long as I live. Ask. That sentence, that specific calculated sentence, was not a moment of cruelty. It was a strategy. It was designed to sever my mother's hope, to make her feel abandoned by the one person whose eventual arrival might have saved her. It was meant to make her stop waiting for me. It nearly worked. The coal that broke everything open did not come from Renee. It came from Mrs. Elaine Dorsey, age 73, who lived 2 houses down from my mother and had known her for 16 years. She had my number from a neighborhood directory my mother had distributed 4 years earlier during an ice storm. She had hesitated for 6 weeks before calling, she told me later, because she wasn't sure she was seeing what she thought she was seeing and she didn't want to cause trouble. "Daniel," she said when I answered on a Wednesday morning in March, I need to tell you something about your mama, and I need you to really listen to me. I was in the parking garage of my office building. I sat down on a concrete step and I listened. Mrs. Dorsey had seen my mother through the front window 3 times in the past month, at different hours, and each time my mother had been sitting alone, unmoving, in the living room in conditions that concerned her. She had once seen my mother standing on the front porch in the cold without a coat, looking at the street like she was waiting for something. She had tried to wave and my mother had not waved back. Not rudeness, she said. Something else. Like she wasn't all the way there. I booked a flight before I called anyone else. I told my manager there was a family emergency. I drove to the airport with a bag I'd packed in 11 minutes. The flight was 3 hours. They were the longest 3 hours of my life. I called my mother's phone, no answer. I texted Renee, no response. I texted Marcus, my brother, who was in Milwaukee for work, and told him to get home as fast as he could. Then I sat in that airplane seat and made promises. To God, to the universe, to nothing I made promises. Let her be okay. Let her be okay. Let her be okay. Whatever okay still means. Let there be enough left of okay for me to work with. I landed at Columbus at 4:17 p.m. and drove straight to my mother's house. I did not stop. I knew something was wrong before I was out of the car. The curtains were drawn, all of them, at 4:30 in the afternoon. The front porch light, which my mother had kept on every single evening since I was a child, a safety habit, a welcoming habit, was not on. There was mail in the box that had not been collected in at least a week. The small potted plant my mother kept on the top porch step had tipped over and no one had righted it. The smell reached me when I opened the front door. Not garbage, not rot, just staleness, old air, a house that had been closed up and not properly aired in too long. The absence of the smells that had always meant home, coffee, dish soap, whatever she was cooking. Mom. The living room was dim, and there she was. She was sitting in her chair, the brown one by the window that she had owned for 15 years, and she was smaller than I had left her. Not just thinner, though she was very thin. Smaller in some other way, like something had gone out of her posture, out of the way she occupied space. She looked up at me when I said her name again. And then she began to cry. I crossed the room, and I got down on my knees in front of her chair. And I held her hands, and I looked at her face, and she looked at my face. And in her eyes I saw the most devastating combination of relief and shame that I have ever witnessed in another human being. She was relieved I was there. She was ashamed that I was seeing her like this. She kept trying to apologize, and I kept telling her to stop, and we stayed there like that for a long time, her crying and me holding on. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked eventually. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I didn't want to be the reason you had to give something up." That sentence. I'm going to live with that sentence for the rest of my life. I called 911. While we waited, I brought her water and found crackers in a cabinet and sat on the floor next to her chair holding her hand. I photographed the state of the house, the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom, the empty refrigerator. I documented everything methodically, the way you do when you know what you have to do next. The paramedics came. They were kind. They assessed her, addressed the blood pressure situation, determined she was malnourished and dehydrated. They wanted her to go to the hospital, and she looked at me and I said, "Go, Mom, I'll be right behind you." She went. Renee was not there. I did not know where she was. I sent her a text that said simply, "Come to the house." Then I sat in my mother's living room in the silence and waited. She told me the story over 3 days, slowly in the hospital and then at home when she was stronger. She didn't tell it all at once. She would say a piece of it and then need to stop. Not because she was hiding anything, but because some of it still hurt too much to move through quickly. I sat next to her every time and I listened to every word. The food restriction had started in week 3. She had thought at first it was disorganization, Renee forgetting to shop, being busy, an oversight. It was not an oversight. The medication had run out in month 3 and she had asked 4 times. She had heard the same answer each time, "I'll handle it." It was never handled. The calls from church friends, she hadn't known they were coming. She had assumed they had moved on, lost interest. She didn't find out until weeks later that the calls had come and been intercepted. Mrs. Dorsey came to the hospital. She was the first neighbor to show up, but not the last. By the second day, there were 3 neighbors who had witnessed things and had, each for their own reasons, hesitated to act. A man named Harold, who lived directly across the street, said he had once seen Renee pull my mother by the arm through the front doorway. He had told himself it wasn't what it looked like. He was not able to look at me when he said it. I worked with a hospital social worker to collect and organize the documentation, my mother's medical records going back 6 months, the photographs I had taken of the house, financial records that showed Renee had been using a shared household card for non-household expenses, the text message history in which Renee had consistently assured me that everything was fine. The timeline was clear, the escalation was clear, the intentionality was clear. Every text message, every "don't worry," every "she had a great day," every "she's resting," every reassurance, every smooth explanation, every photograph of soup and sunny afternoons, all of it, every single word had been a lie constructed to keep me away while my mother suffered inside that house. Every reassurance was a lie. Not one of them was true. When I understood the full scope of it, when the timeline was in front of me, and the evidence was organized, and the neighbors had confirmed what I now knew, I did not cry. I sat in a hospital waiting room chair, and I looked at my hands, and I felt something settle in my chest that was very cold and very clear. Renee was going to face every consequence available to me to give her. She came to the house, my mother's house, 2 days after I arrived. I don't know what she expected. Perhaps she thought she could manage me the way she had managed my mother. Perhaps she thought her explanations would work on me the way they had worked over the phone. I let her in. I was calm. I had made a decision, before she arrived, to be calm. I sat across from her at my mother's kitchen table, and I let her talk first. She was good. I will give her that. She was very good. She expressed concern. She said she had noticed my mother seemed down lately. She offered explanations for the weight loss, a stomach thing, poor appetite, age. She explained the medication gap as a pharmacy issue, a miscommunication. She was warm and composed, and her concern sounded completely real. I let her finish. Then I opened the folder on the table between us. I put down the medical records first, then the photographs of the house, then the bank statements. Then the printed text message thread, our complete correspondence over 6 months with certain lines underlined. Then the written statements from 3 neighbors. I did not speak while I was putting these things down. I let her look. I watched her face change. It happened slowly, and then all at once, the composure thinned. The warmth dropped out. What was underneath was not what I expected. It was not guilt, not shame, not the face of someone confronting what they had done. It was calculation. Even then, even in that moment, she was calculating. She started to speak again. A new explanation, a different angle. I stopped her. "You told my mother," I said, "that I left because I was tired of dealing with her. You told her I wasn't coming back. You told her that while she was in that chair, malnourished, without her blood pressure medication, while you were using her household account to buy things for yourself." She opened her mouth. "Don't," I said. The silence was total. "I will never forgive you," I said. "Never. Not in this lifetime. Not in any amount of time. What you did to that woman, what you said to her, how you made her feel, there is no version of sorry that addresses it. There is nothing you can say to me at this table." I stood up. "The police have already been contacted. A lawyer has already been retained. You should find representation." She left. She walked out of that kitchen, and I stood at the window and watched her car pull away, and I felt the cold clarity in my chest settle deeper, harder, into something permanent. Legal destruction. The police report was filed on my 4th day home. I brought the folder, the same folder I had put on the kitchen table, and I sat across from a detective named Alvarez, who was thorough and unhurried, and who looked at the documentation with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were seeing. The charges that followed were elder abuse and neglect under Ohio state law, financial exploitation of an elderly adult, and criminal negligence related to the medication situation. The prosecutor later told me this was among the better documented cases of its kind she had seen. The paper trail was nearly complete. Renee was arrested 11 days after I filed the report. I did not watch, but Mrs. Dorsey did and called me immediately after. I had hired a lawyer within 48 hours of arriving home, a woman named Christine Dahl who specialized in elder law, and who spoke with a directness I found deeply comforting in those early weeks. She filed a civil suit alongside the criminal charges, seeking damages for medical costs, pain and suffering, and financial losses. The criminal case took 14 months. I will not pretend those 14 months were easy. My mother had to give testimony. She prepared for weeks, and she was composed on the stand in a way that broke my heart, composed because she had been conditioned to manage her own emotions to avoid causing problems for other people. But she told the truth, every word of it. Renee's lawyer attempted to frame my mother as confused, as forgetful, as unreliable. The three neighbors' testimonies ended that strategy. The medical records ended it further. Christine's cross-examination ended whatever remained. The verdict came on a Tuesday, guilty on all primary charges. Renee was sentenced to 22 months in a correctional facility, 5 years of probation following release, and mandatory participation in a mental health and ethics program. The civil suit settled prior to the criminal verdict for an amount I have chosen not to disclose publicly, but which covered my mother's medical bills entirely and then some. When the verdict was read, I was sitting behind the prosecutor's table, my mother beside me, her hand in mine. I felt her hand tighten when the word guilty was spoken. That was all she did. She didn't cry. She just held my hand tighter, and I held back. Social annihilation. I contacted the Ohio State Board of Nursing within the first week. I submitted the documentation. There was a formal review. Renee's nursing license was suspended, pending the criminal investigation, and later revoked following the conviction. She will not work as a nurse again. Marcus. My brother separated from her before the arrest. When I called him from the hospital the night I arrived and found my mother, he drove back from Milwaukee immediately. When he saw his mother-in-law, when he saw the state of the house, the medical records, the weight his mother had lost, he did not defend his wife. He sat in a hospital corridor with his head in his hands for a long time. He is still working through his own part in the story, and I believe that process will take him years. Renee's family was contacted. Her professional references were contacted. The church community she had been part of was informed, quietly, with evidence, without drama. The social and professional world she had inhabited contracted around her like a closing fist. Financial ruin. The civil judgment included asset recovery. Wages from any future employment would be garnished until the judgment was satisfied. The financial exploitation charges added separate restitution requirements under criminal sentencing. By the time the legal process concluded, Renee had no professional license, no career, a criminal record, a civil judgment against her, and no community of any kind. She had systematically isolated my mother, and in the end the isolation she had engineered became a mirror. She was now the one who had no one. Poetic justice. My mother recovered. I need to tell you that first because if I don't tell you that immediately, you will spend the rest of this section bracing for the worst, and you deserve to know she is here. She is not who she was before. I want to be honest about that too. The weight came back, the medication is managed, the blood pressure is stable, the house is warm and clean and smells like coffee and dish soap again. But something in her is quieter than it was. She laughs at the same things, loves the same things, still calls everyone baby, but sometimes I catch her in a moment when she is still and very far away, and I know where she is. She is back in that chair, in that dim living room, believing the person she had trusted had told her the truth about me. I quit the Austin job, not dramatically, not angrily. I called my manager, explained the situation, gave 2 weeks' notice over the phone, and drove back to Ohio. I lost the opportunity, the salary, the trajectory I had been building. I'm starting over professionally in a way that is real and that I do not pretend is entirely easy. I do not regret it. I have searched myself for regret on this particular point and I cannot locate any. The guilt is harder. The guilt is not something I expect to fully resolve. It lives in the quiet moments, in the early mornings before the house wakes up, in the last few minutes before sleep, In moments when my mother and I are sitting at the kitchen table making pancakes on a Sunday, and I look at her and think about the months when that table was silent and cold, and she was sitting in the other room alone. I will carry that guilt. It is appropriate to carry it. It is the tax on having been away. Renee's apology letter arrived 3 months after the verdict. It was 2 pages long. I read it once. I sat with it. I tried genuinely to find something in it that felt like accountability rather than management of consequences. I could not find it. I disposed of it, as my mother had asked me to do with hers, and I have not looked back. Mom, I love you. If you have made it to this point in the story, I need to talk to you directly, not as a narrator, not as someone telling you about events that happened to him. As a person, to a person. This channel exists because something real happened to me and to my mother, and silence felt like its own kind of betrayal. It felt like letting what was done to her live only in the dark. She agreed to let me tell this story. She sat at the same kitchen table where we made pancakes, and she said, "If it helps somebody, then tell it." That is who she is. That is exactly who she is. Here is what I know now that I did not know before. Love is not only a feeling. Love is a practice. Love is presence. Love is the willingness to be inconvenient, to be disruptive, to cancel plans and lose money and show up at the door when something in you says something is wrong. Love is not something you outsource and then trust the report. No one loves your parent the way you do. This is not a criticism of anyone who has ever asked for help. I needed help. There was nothing wrong with needing help. But the person you trust with your parents' safety will never, no matter how good they are, love that person the way you do. That asymmetry matters. It means you cannot simply hand over responsibility and assume it will be honored the way you would honor it. You have to stay involved. You have to keep asking the question behind the question. Phone calls can lie. I need you to hear this. A voice on a phone can be coached, can be managed, can be performed under conditions of fear or pressure that you cannot detect from 3 states away. The absence of distress in a voice is not the same as the absence of distress. Text messages and check-ins from a third party are not neutral data. They are that person's version of events filtered through their interests. If something feels wrong, go check. I am not asking you to be paranoid. I am asking you to take your instincts seriously. The feeling I had, that thing in the back of my chest during the first call, the cursor hovering over the flight purchase during the second, the cold hand during the third, those feelings were correct. I talked myself out of all 3 of them, and I will live with that forever. She told my mother that I wasn't coming back. She used my absence as a weapon against my mother's hope, and my mother, in her exhaustion and her isolation, had started to believe it. Ask. I will never forget that as long as I live. If you are watching this and something has been nagging at you, a call that felt slightly off, a visit that was overdue, an instinct you've been rationalizing away, please, I am asking you not to make my mistake. Go, check, protect, today, right now, not tomorrow, not after this video ends, now. Hast! She is worth it. Whatever it costs you, whatever you have to rearrange, whatever plans you have to break, she is worth every single bit of it. I love you, Mom. I'm not going anywhere.